Hello, we're Soul Margin Fishing and Conservation Foundation, and welcome to our channel. Come join us here every Sunday for Soul Sunday, where we release new videos. Please donate to our cause and subscribe now. Hey everybody, I want to welcome you to our webinar. I'm Captain Sam Baker of Soul Margin Fishing and Conservation Foundation. I'm the founder, and I'm super excited today because this kicks off our webinar series for the whole year, right? We have like a ton of seminars going up. They're going to be almost every month, but this one to me is special, right? So I want to apologize, number one, about the computer gremlins. For some reason, everything just wanted to go down, from the internet to the servers, different things, but man, we're still super excited to have this. So one thing I want to put in front of your mind is, if you look down, you'll see the chat, or if in YouTube, you'll see the chat as well. As we go through this webinar, any questions you may have, put it in there, because we're going to have a QA section during this webinar that you can ask our speaker some awesome questions, man. So I'm not wasting any more time. I know we're behind, but I want to get right into it and tell you about this guy, man. This guy, I met him during COVID on a webinar, and he's just an amazing person, man. He is full of energy. When I'm around him, when we talk on webinars on the phone, man, he's just the man, right? He's an award-winning researcher. He's an award-winning photographer, and he's just an all-around cool dude, man, to be around. He is a whole bunch of good energy. And I'm going to take his phrase that he says to explain him, and that's legend. This guy's legendary. So I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to bring him in here. So I want you guys to get excited for Clark Morgan, man. I'm going to bring him in. Clark, brother, super excited to have you here, man. You know, the gremlins have ripped things up and tore things up, but you know, we're still having fun. How are you doing today, man?
I'm great, Captain Sam. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Thank you everyone for joining us. And yeah, I love our full circle moment here of when we first met on a webinar, and here we are now, you know, giving it back again one more time. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, man, it's awesome. I'm excited for you to share your research, man. I was just down at Florida Atlantic University, Harbor Branch, where you were. I forgot to tell him, dude, you were here as a student at UNF. You graduated from UNF, worked at Whitney Labs when I met you, and now down in South Florida doing some great things, man. So the research you showed me in person, I don't want to ruin it. So I'm going to hand it over to you. You're going to do your thing, and we're going to keep going. All right, brother?
Sounds great, man. And thank you for your kind words. Remember, it takes one to know one. So.
Thanks, man.
We're in good company. And yep, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for joining live. And if you're joining us after the fact, thank you very much for that as well. Are we ready to dive in, Captain Sam? All right. All right, guys. Well, thank you again for joining me. Today's presentation is called Evading Extinction in the Anthropocene, Guiding the Goliath Grouper, which the scientific name is Epinephelus itajara. This is their Latin name, and Epinephelus is a grouper group. The itajara translates to Latin, which means king of the rock, which is pretty interesting when we'll get in later into some artificial reefs and their habitat preferences. So as Sam mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate at Florida Atlantic University based at Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute, which is in Fort Pierce, Florida. It's the Treasure Coast area. And I work under the tutelage of Dr. Matt Ajamian in the Fisheries Ecology and Conservation Lab. So I'm going to present some of the groundbreaking research that I'm doing for my dissertation on Goliath grouper, as well as introduce you all to the species and understand what's so amazing about this species, particularly for us here in Florida, and how they've evaded extinction once before and are now, again, up against some modern management changes that really matters for the science we're doing moving forward. And for those who don't know, Anthropocene, that means the epoch, the time of Earth's history that humans are here. So an epoch, just like Jurassic, Triassic, the Anthropocene is defined by humans. So this is a photo I took of a Goliath grouper in Jupiter, Florida. And at first we see one giant fish with many small bait fish swimming around it. If we look a little bit closer underneath it, we see a weird looking fin down here in the middle. And then as the next photo I took in this encounter, we realize that's not a fin, that's a human. All right. So here's a great taste of the size of the Goliath grouper here. Okay. People can hide behind them. This animal, if you look around your house right now, if you're on a couch, if you see a refrigerator or a door, that's the size of this fish, okay? It's the largest reef-dwelling bony fish in the Western Atlantic Ocean. So here's a great encounter for somebody hanging out with a Goliath grouper underwater. At certain times of year in South Florida, you can see dozens of these giant animals during the daytime, approachable for photographers underwater, highly charismatic. This is world-class scuba diving, incredible encounter. Or maybe you've caught one before. Here's an adult Goliath grouper caught fishing offshore. So big, this is your trophy photo, although sometimes you jump in the water with them. They're too big to lift out of the water, depending on what water you're in. It's against the regulations. So again, incredible memory, an incredible fish to see underwater or on the side of the boat. Or maybe you've hooked into one before, but you're not sure exactly what it was. You've caught something that you can't move. It can't budge. It's not swimming like a big shark. It's just parked itself under a bridge. Might be a Goliath grouper. This is a father-son pair from France who come to Fort Pierce, Florida to fish for these incredible animals. So again, we're very lucky to have them here in Florida as a native species. Maybe more recently, you've identified a juvenile, you've caught a juvenile, or maybe your friends have caught a juvenile and offered you to eat it. We'll talk about that a little bit later too. So just trying to familiarize you with the Goliath grouper and see what interactions have happened out there. Or maybe you're a fisherman or a spear fisherman and you don't like Goliath grouper because of this reason right here. This is called depredation. Check this out. Spear fisherman shoots a snapper, but the Goliath grouper sees an easy meal. Some bad words underwater, and the Goliath grouper swims off with the catch there, okay? So that's called depredation, right? Where the Goliath grouper takes the fish that you've already caught. This can happen on a hook and line as well. Just an example of some of these interactions for this species. So an overview of my talk tonight, I'm going to present to you the history of the Goliath grouper, some current context and challenges facing the species in the management, the local significance, particularly where I am a little bit further on the southeast coast of Florida. Boom, we're going to let you listen to something you probably never heard before, present my integrative research projects that are I'm following the Goliath grouper for my dissertation research. Then we're going to take a glance from a Goliath grouper, something I promise you've never seen before. And then again, the discussion where this is leading and what other questions we have from the audience. To begin, I want to kind of put our fisheries management caps on here. And in the most simplified explanation, I like to think of fisheries management as this three-headed triangle, three-headed snake, where it's an intersection of the biology of the fish, how long do they live, how big do they get, where do they live, what do they eat, the policy, the rules, the law, the regulations, and then the socioeconomics. who is what people are interacting with the fishery, what scuba divers are interacting with the fishery, who are the stakeholders, right? We are the stakeholders. If we're tuned into this webinar tonight, we have an investment, whether it's an economical investment, an emotional investment in the fisheries. So again, this simplified triangle: policy, biology, socioeconomics. These things are often unbalanced in direction and magnitude, but they're often interacting in a very dynamic way. And so, again, this is just the kind of lens to think of things tonight. So the biology of the Goliath grouper, the Atlantic Goliath grouper, okay, they're large, long-lived. I mentioned they're the largest bony fish, reef-dwelling bony fish in the Western Atlantic Ocean. That's different from cartilaginous fishes like sharks, skates, and rays. So up to about 700 feet long, over 700 pounds, at least 37 years old. That's the oldest one that's ever been aged. They may live longer than that. We just haven't detected that yet. They have a late maturity, so they grow pretty slow till about 4 to 6 years old when they're about 3 feet long, right? So some fish don't even live to be 3 feet long, but the juveniles become adults at 3 feet long. Again, just giving you a taste of their life history. They change sex, so they're hermaphroditic, which is complicating. They can go from, they start off as female and go to male. They are coastal, so they live within 0 to 300 feet, so they're within access to humans. They're not in the pelagic zone. They're sedentary, so they don't move much once they establish a habitat. They form predictable aggregations for mating, which is what I showed you in the scuba diving photos earlier, and we'll talk more about these mating aggregations later. They prefer high relief habitat, so they like things that they can get underneath, high volume, high relief, such as a bridge piling, a shipwreck, concrete, a natural ledge, etc. They're accessible to people given that they are close to the coast, form predictable aggregations, kind of easy to catch if you know what you're looking for. So in that sense, historically, they've been very vulnerable to overfishing and has really decimated their populations historically. Their life cycle, so we'll start here in the spawning aggregation these animals meet. Here's their natural ledge. They hang out, they get together, they release their sperm and eggs in the water column. Those drift as larvae. This larva then settles in the mangroves. They live in the mangroves inshore habitats, again, for 4 to 6 years while they're developing. As juveniles, once they reach sexual maturity, about 4 to 6 years old, about 1 meter in length, 3 feet in length, they then recruit back to the offshore population to meet with the other adults, grow big and strong, spawn, release their young, and let those young then settle in the estuaries in the mangroves to begin again. Okay, so this is a pretty common multi-stage pelagic larval duration life history, life cycle. When those larvae do settle, they settle in those mangrove systems. And if you're familiar with Florida, you know that some of those habitats are very degraded. Most of those habitats are degraded. If we look in the left-hand southwest corner here of the 10,000 islands in the Gulf of Mexico, this is one of our pristine areas of nursery ground habitat of mangroves on the West Coast. We believe that this system alone may be supporting the populations of the entire Gulf of Mexico. If we look on the East Coast, we can see that we have eutrophication and mangrove loss from coastal development. Most of these systems, I'm working on the Indian River Lagoon. That's where my university is placed, and I'll show you a map on the inlets that we're working on this Indian River Lagoon. So despite this habitat being degraded, it's still very important to understand the population dynamics of the juveniles that are recruiting to these areas, and then their eventual recruitment back out to the adult populations. And at the same time, what adult populations are facilitating the recruitment into these estuaries. We believe this is a big bottleneck to their overall population recovery. Why does their population need to be recovered? Well, let's talk about the history of the fishery. Okay, so here, the beginner history lesson, this fish was hunted, caught, harvested starting in the 1800s, probably sooner than that, 1600s there's some records of. But essentially in the 1900s, what became, take one fish back and feed the village, quickly snowballed into taking more than was necessary, taking more than basically taking in excess, overexploitation, as we had new technologies such as depth sonar chart, sonar sounders that allowed you to read the bottom. When you were offshore on boats, you could stay offshore longer, refrigeration, new fishing technology. Essentially, from the 1950s to the 1980s, this species was completely overexploited and the population collapsed. They were overfished through the 80s, then they were protected in 1990. In 1990, they were protected from the federal and state levels. And then as time passed, they were removed from the federal government's National Marine Fishery Services Species of Concern list in 2006. It's important to note that they're still federally protected during this NIMS designation. And this is before we understood the threats of acute events such as harmful algal blooms and cold freezes. Until in 2018, they were removed from the International Union on the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, red list. They were removed from critically endangered to vulnerable. It's important to note that this was because of a definition change on the IUCN's point. No new data was added to the Goliath grouper population understanding. So we have this idea that their populations have recovered, as you would imagine if they've been protected for 30 years, but not in their historical ranges, not off the coast of Africa, not in South America. And so this recovery has provided some conflicting public perceptions. And again, I mentioned that when they were removed from the NIMS list in 2006, we didn't understand the threats to their population. Well, we know that now cold water below 60 degrees is lethal. Harmful algal blooms like red tide is very bad news for these species and most species that are red tide encounters. Mercury pollution, it's a long-lived fish. They accumulate mercury as they get older. Further juvenile habitat destruction from further coastal development. And the negative fishery interactions, which I'll talk about. Now that they've recovered, we've got people who are upset about the recovery and the laws are changing again. So here's a Goliath grouper that was basically had a lethal encounter with red tide in the Gulf of Mexico. It was as an adult, even though it was inshore, this was an adult. So this is bad news for losing a large animal such as this that could be reproducing. So in Florida, which is where I'm doing my research, obviously, and hopefully where most of us fish, we do know that there have been increasing juvenile abundance in these inshore nursery habitats. But again, these things are very susceptible to acute events that can diminish all that progress from the population recovery. And then with less mangrove available, there's just a less chance of recovery. The adult numbers are certainly increasing in certain numbers offshore in certain places, but there's this large caveat to the population management of this species overall. From a fisheries management point of view, we don't know how many Goliath grouper are out there. We cannot estimate how many Goliath grouper are out there because they've been protected for over 30 years. Traditionally, that's where you would get a long-term historical abundance data to when you monitor historical catches through time. We do not have that for the Goliath grouper because of their protected status. So it's kind of a perfect storm of fisheries management problems. So the public perception is complicated, right? So this is the socioeconomic side of things where we, the stakeholders, have our opinions. So who is interacting with the fish? Well, some people are complaining that they're a nuisance and that they eat everything else on the wreck or on the ships or, on the artificial reefs. And if there's too many of them, they're going to negatively impact other species. They're going to ruin the mutton snapper, they're going to ruin the cobia, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, there are some opinions and some science that suggest that Goliath grouper enhance the habitat. They increase biodiversity. They're well adapted for artificial reefs. I mentioned their affinity for high relief, high volume structure. They have positive economic impacts for those that are scuba diving with them. And there are now world-class ecotourism dive industries that depend on the Goliath grouper for seasonal aggregations to encounter the animal. And then we're a success story for native species, right? This animal is native to Florida. They almost went extinct. We protected them. They've recovered, which is great, but it's kind of problematic in the sense. So it's also a little bit of shifting baseline syndrome, meaning that things are changing in a sense that we can't really perceive that change. So we think it's a natural change taking place, but we think something's up. So with changing and these shifting management regulations and shifting public perceptions, there's recently been a change where you can now harvest the juveniles. Okay, so after 32 years of protection, the juveniles during a small certain season of March to May. In certain areas, I'll show you a map, they are up to 200 Goliath grouper may be harvested a year now, okay? This is a slot limit similar to our red drum of 24 to 36 inches in total length. So a tight little slot there, again, before they're technically mature, hopefully. This has to be hook and line only. You cannot spearfish for them. And then there's some sampling requirements where we want the FWC would like you to submit tissue samples and some catch information to them. What's really interesting about this for my research and for the conservation issues I'm interested in, I mentioned I'm in Southeast Florida. I live in St. Lucie County, and I do my campus is in St. Lucie County here on this map in the green, but we work in St. Lucie and Martin counties. What does this map show? This map shows the open and closed areas where if you catch a Goliath grouper and you have a permit for one, that you can harvest it. So if you notice here on the east coast of Florida, up here from basically Amelia Island all the way down to the St. Lucie River is open harvest if in season. Then on this orange from Martin County, which is Stewart, all the way down to the Keys on the Atlantic side, it's closed for harvest. On the west coast of Florida, this is all fair game. Okay, so again, it's highly regulated in both space and time, such that it has to be during this small season from March to May. What's really interesting, though, about this boundary is that this has basically been designated so that the animals that are living the juveniles that are inside the Indian River Lagoon, they can recruit offshore to the populations that are being encountered for the ecotourism dive industry. So we have basically a little bit of a compromise here where, yes, there's enough Goliath grouper where we think that we can start to harvest the juveniles again, but we want to be careful and not impact the adult populations offshore, particularly the adult populations that people are relying on for economic benefit. So interesting thing happening here. It's changing. And that's the way management is. You get more information, you change the rules. So with that information, I mentioned that mercury is a big issue for the Goliath grouper. On the x-axis here on the bottom, we can see fish size in millimeters, which is basically meters. So from a very small fish to 1,000 millimeters right here is 3 feet, all the way down here to about 7.5 feet. So what we can, and then muscle mercury levels are here on the y-axis. So the higher you go on this y-axis, the more mercury that was detected in the tissue of Goliath grouper. So this is a very comprehensive analysis of the entire size and age class of Goliath grouper. And what we can see, which would be expected and is common in other reef fishes, particularly predatory reef fishes, is that the bigger you are, the longer you live, the more mercury you accumulate in your tissues. And now this is obviously what matters to human. The environmental recommendation for us is less than 0.46. And we can see basically that the slot limit that's being proposed, that is allowed for harvest now, is right around that number, okay? So this is also some information on what the decision was made around. Again, just presenting to you the information that the managers are using for changing these policies based on the biology, right? So back to our triangle here. Now, a stakeholder engagement opportunity separate of the management issues is called the Great Goliath Grouper Count. And this is, if there's any scuba divers out there, and I encourage you to get involved with this if you haven't already. It's a really awesome opportunity, great reason to go diving, and you haven't missed it this year. But essentially, this is a citizen science collaboration with the state of Florida, the University of Florida, Florida Sea Grant, and FWC, the Fish and Wildlife Commission, and volunteer divers. Okay, I've contributed to this, right? So basically what this is that it's a snapshot of the Goliath grouper abundance in the first 2 weeks of June, from June 1st to June 14th. So if you go out scuba diving, there's basically a visual scuba diver survey that you would take notes when you get underwater or when you got back up on the surface of how many Goliath grouper you saw, where did you see them, how big were they, etc. This data is then compiled with the state, and then is used to try to fill in some of those gaps I mentioned where the traditional stock assessment methods don't work for the protected species, right? So we're trying to get a relative index of abundance that can be used to monitor populations locally here in Florida. It's a little bit more of a easier problem to solve locally than it is for the federal government to say how many Goliath grouper there are in the entire ocean, if that makes sense. So contact your local Florida Sea Grant agent today for more information. Contact me or through Sam, please, if you're interested in contributing to this. Again, June 1st through 14th. And I'll show you what it looks like. This is Goliath grouper survey results over the past 14 years. It's the 15th year starting this year. So we can see there's been a lot of effort. There's been a lot of Goliath grouper, and there's a lot of places where Goliath grouper have been missed. So we're trying to fill in these gaps and, again, provide some citizen science engagement opportunities with the stakeholders that provides legitimate scientific data that's using to fill in the gaps for the management of this species. So now we're back to the Anthropocene, okay? I want to kind of change gears a little bit here and use our imaginations and go back 1,000 years in mind in time and space. A place I often go when I'm on the ocean, just thinking about what the world was once like and how can we get it back to there. So maybe there was a sailboat on the water 1,000 years ago as the Vikings were moving across the stormy North Atlantic, but there weren't very many human-made sounds. Maybe there was a canoe paddle on the Indian River Lagoon or the Eyes Indians paddling around, but it was essentially natural noise. The coral reef would make noise, the snapping shrimp, the whales would make noise as they're communicating across ocean basins. You know, sometimes there would be an earthquake of tectonic activity, but more or less everything was produced from life or living biology or geology. Now let's take a look at what the ocean looks like today in the Anthropocene, in the human world. And here we have seismic surveys going on looking for oil wells, pile driving for bridge construction. We have sonar going on for, military defense, military ships. Of course, wars going on out there, fishing boats making noise, low-flying airplanes, right? All of this anthropogenic noise that is now very quickly in the past 200 years completely changed the soundscape of the ocean. What's really interesting and what we have to think about is sound in water travels faster and further than it does in air, okay? Up to 4 times as fast. Whales can communicate across ocean basins when there's no ships in the area. Well, it's a little bit different now that we have all these ships. So again, just thinking about the noise in the ocean and the soundscape of the Anthropocene. Well, why do we care about that? Well, because Goliath grouper make noise, of course. They make sound production, okay? And I'm going to play a quick clip for you here to give you a little taste of the Goliath grouper sound production. All right, one more time. Now you know what to expect. This is me under a shipwreck. It sounded like a bomb went off one of those seismic surveys I just mentioned. Well, let's have a look at what happens next. Relive this again. That's me reacting to it. And as I get closer, I realize the Goliath grouper that made that sound. Okay? There's a territorial sound saying, "What are you doing in my home?" I give the fish some space here because he's making noise at me, which was a little defense mechanism. And now I get close to it and check it out. You can see I have an orange tag on it. So this is a fish that I'm actually monitoring its position. And then it's swimming about underneath this shipwreck, going about its way, just letting me know it knows I'm there, okay? So incredible sound production, incredible force, and an incredible feature of nature, a phenomenon of nature, that these animals produce sound. And matter of fact, over 900 species of fish produce sound. So this isn't anything new to nature, but it's new to us scientists of measuring this sound and using it as a way to understand the Goliath grouper. So that boom that we felt is a low frequency, about 60 hertz, 60 to 100 hertz sound that will go up to over 148 decibels. This is louder than arenas or stadiums. Again, very much like some warfare going on, but an incredible sound that you can feel and measure. And what this is called a spectrogram here, where you can measure the acoustic energy of the sound production. And the single pulse, again, is just showing that noise is visible and detectable with the right equipment. And that noise is incredibly important for territoriality, as we just saw, but also for courtship and spawning. Okay, so I showed you the photos earlier of the spawning aggregation and these incredible opportunities to encounter these animals. Well, this is what they look like during the daytime when you can approach them as a scuba diver. You can see dozens of them at the same time. Again, world-class diving during the daytime. We can observe these animals. We know that they're hanging out on these certain areas, certain reefs. We can go check them out. But what we don't know, but what we assume, the spawning aggregation, is that they eventually spawn. Spawning is when the females release their eggs, the males release their sperm and the water column at the same time. They fertilize, form a zygote, and then drift through the ocean currents for eventual dispersal or retention. The photo on the right here is a photo of spawning grouper from the Indo-Pacific. These are camouflage grouper. Essentially what you're seeing here, though, is that cloud of fertilized eggs, or eggs being fertilized, rather, taking place at night in the water column. Goliath grouper also spawn at night. The idea for spawning at night is that it basically limits how much predation can take place from the small fish that live around the Goliath grouper, who are visual predators looking for all of the eggs in the water column. At night, it's a little bit harder to see those, okay? It's also harder to see the Goliath grouper, but it led us to the question, can we directly observe these behaviors of spawning in Goliath grouper remotely using advanced remote technologies so that we can understand their biology a little bit better, so that we can improve their management through the biology and socioeconomics of this greater understanding of this fish? Well, before we can do that for the Goliath grouper, let's see what's been done in other fish. Have you heard? We know of Fitbits, right? Or our smartwatches or our smartphones that have, when you rotate the phone, the screen rotates as well. Okay, same idea basically. That's being measured with an accelerometer or an inertial measurement unit, okay, an IMU. And essentially what that is are small sensors that measure motion in 3 dimensions. When you twist, when you turn, up, down, sideways, back and forth, okay? And what you can do is you can measure those motions on an animal and use those to describe certain behaviors, especially when you observe what the animal does in its behavior, and then you can line that up in time on the accelerometer data, on the movement data, and then you can essentially classify the behaviors. When you see this squiggly line, you know that it must mean that the animal is doing this. Or when you see that squiggly line, it must mean it's doing that. So this was, it's been ground truth in a lot of different species. A colleague of mine proved this in lemon sharks, where, again, she observed their behaviors visually, compared that to what she saw from the accelerometry data, and was able to essentially describe the behaviors of the lemon sharks in the wild. It's the same thing we're going to try to do with Goliath grouper, using this premise of the fish Fitbits. For the Goliath grouper, ours looks, and you can see here on this lemon shark, this tiny little circle, that's the fish bit on the fish. Okay, so small, this animal is about 2 feet. Okay, so it's small tag, small fish. Goliath grouper, big tag, giant fish, right? So I want to show you this. This is called a CATS cam. CATS stands for Customizable Animal Tracking Solution. CAM stands for camera. If we look at the diagram here, we can see a camera lens on the front. This is a biologging tag. Okay, biologging means it's, again, measuring motion of the animal, the biology of the animal, logging that data, storing that data on the tag, and then we can eventually download it later. So here on this CATS cam, we have a camera lens. We have a hydrophone to listen to noise. the IMU, inertial measurement unit, what I just described as that fish bit, a depth and temperature sensor so we can collect some environmental data. Then we use a piece of metal called a GTR that corrodes in salt water after a certain amount of time. That releases, detaches from the fish. This is attached to the fish's dorsal spines with some thread. And when that GTR dissolves, the tag disintegrates, or excuse me, the GTR disintegrates, the tag removes itself from the fish and floats up for recovery, with a satellite transmitter used to locate exactly where it is for us to go pick it up. Hypothetically, that's how the CATS cams work. And here you can see the back of the fish and the spines. I'll show you what that looks like on the fish later. But to begin, I mentioned that you have to observe the behaviors to be able to figure out what they mean on the line. So we use the St. Lucie power plant. This is on South Hutchinson Island. This is a nuclear power plant that brings in ocean water to cool the reactors, and it provides a really nice simulated ecosystem for us, like a little aquarium mesocosm, okay, where we deploy these CATS cams on 6 fish for over 50 hours to begin to get a baseline understanding of what behaviors we can expect of a Goliath grouper. So check out this video that will show some of the original captivity work of this method of deploying the CATS cams. There's no sound in this video. Okay, so these guys, again, are just catching these Goliath grouper in this little impoundment, basically a little pond. We put the Goliath grouper in a little trough. There's seawater in that hose so the animal can breathe, right? There's fresh seawater going over the gills. We'll measure the girth of the animal to understand its body condition, how wide it is. And then what you're going to see, I promise that the animal does not respond to this. We've worked on this several different ways, and this is the best attachment method. But we drill through the dorsal spines with a special drill bit. Again, the animal does not feel it, does not respond. And this allows us to get a very snug fit on the back of the Goliath grouper for us to then put these threads through, tie these threads around a screw, and then secure this camera tag to the back of the fish. Okay? And what you'll see here is then the animal swim away from this encounter and be very happy about it afterwards. So again, this is our in captivity experiment to learn what the Goliath grouper do for behavior. So there we go. Goliath grouper swimming away with a CATS cam on top of it there. It kind of looks like a laser beam. But I promise we're not evil masterminds. This is for the benefit of science. So the Goliath grouper swims away. All right. I want to show you what happens in the next slide. Here we go. Okay, what does that look like in captivity? Let's check it out. So the Goliath grouper, again, we're after some behaviors here. The squiggly line, read out the parameter, and then the video of the behavior. So here, we're now on the back of a Goliath grouper here, guys. In captivity, but still pretty awesome. Boom. There's that boom we've been talking about. Engulfing behaviors. These are the first time we've ever observed any of this. We get a lot of credit for being a lazy fish, yet when they want to move, they can burst. Here's feeding on a big old black margate. Okay, big ambush predator there. Easy meal. So forward swimming. Again, you're comfortable by being on the shoulders of this Goliath grouper. We're swimming around this little pond with it, but we're going to get to the ocean next. Gliding. Here you can hear the snapping shrimp. And then hovering. There's a rough shark down there, turning, okay, doing what a fish does, right? Just kind of swimming about a beautiful artificial reef, basically, with other Goliath grouper. And laying on their sides, this was an interesting one. Just kind of roll over, maybe they're getting some belly scratches, maybe something else is going on. And then a lot of sitting. So sometimes they do live up to their reputation as a lazy fish. But I think they're energy efficient. Underside view. And then this shaking, which is an interesting, we think this is some kind of communication. Some visual communication. So when we look at all these combined and we classify these behaviors through time and what they're spending their time doing, we see about 11 different behaviors show up, as you just saw for those videos. 13 different classes of behaviors. But about 95% of the time they're doing three things. They're hovering, or they're floating. They're either swimming and moving, covering ground, or they're resting and just sitting on bottom like this photo I took. Okay, again, this is what they do in captivity. More or less semi-captivity experiment. But we want to know, what about a more natural setting? What are these Goliath grouper doing in the field? What is their natural behavior? Can we just record it with these tags? Again, we're interested in spawning. So now we're on the back of a Goliath grouper. And what you're going to see come over the top of this video is that IMU data, okay, the accelerometer data, where we can see the animals changing depth, moving its head, being shown in these, particularly in the red line here, as the animal's turning and making big swivels and sways, moving around an artificial reef. And then you'll see another Goliath grouper in the bottom right and another cat's cam on a Goliath grouper coming up there, the yellow. And then we'll see this animal. So we're swimming, and then it's going to go lay up underneath some structure. But this gives you a taste of our ability to study these animals in the wild and then hopefully get these tags back to download this data, okay? An incredible amount of data, over 250 data points per second when everything's firing at the same time. So it's massive, but of course, it's a very intimate perspective of a Goliath grouper that you just can't get as a scuba diver. So the difference, though, between catching this Goliath grouper in the wild and catching them at the power plant was about 20 meters of depth. And 20 meters of depth introduces a new problem called barotrauma. Barotrauma is what happens when the animal is brought up from depth. And you can see this animal's bloated here. This one's got its stomach sticking out of its mouth. Okay. This is bad news. But this is common. And what is barotrauma? Barotrauma is the injury from the pressure change. There's the decrease in pressure as the fish is brought to the surface. So as the fish is brought to the surface, there's less pressure. The gas-filled organs, such as their swim bladder or their eyes, or overexpand. The swim bladder is the organ. It's like a balloon that they have inside of them that they use to regulate their buoyancy, so they can float, sink, or hover and move about their way. That overexpands during barotrauma, and there's two ways to handle that. You can either vent it, you can pierce that balloon, that swim bladder, to decompress it so that the fish can then go back down to the bottom, or you can recompress it naturally where you force the fish back down to the bottom with weighted descent. We put a weight and a clip in the fish's mouth, drop it down to the bottom. When it gets down to the bottom, the fish swims off of that clip, and you do not have to pierce the swim bladder for that kind of mitigation. Hypothetically, these are the kind of methods that are using right now. So let's work through this with the Goliath grouper. We hook a Goliath grouper, fight it for a while, bring it to the surface. We get our trophy photo, as we saw, which is awesome. But this animal's got some pretty bad barotrauma. Yes, it's floating, as we can see, and then it's severe so much that the stomach has distended the other direction. This is bad news. If this is not handled appropriately, this animal is left to float, okay? And if it's left to float, they cannot mitigate this barotrauma themselves. And then here we have a great hammerhead unnaturally eating a Goliath grouper that has been floating on the surface. There's increasing reports of these floating fish being depredated on by large sharks at the surface. There's a lot of problems with this. It's unaccounted for because this is a fishing mortality event that's not accounted for in our fisheries management equations. And it's, again, an unnatural, this is basically the barotrauma is not handled correctly. So this is improper handling by the anglers that's producing this unnatural, undocumented, or unrecorded interactions. So for smaller reef species, maybe you've used these before. It's required depending on where you're fishing, Gulf State, federal waters, etc. But a barotrauma mitigation device, this is called a sequelizer. A sequelizer is a pressurized clamp that hooks onto the fish's lip with some down weight, drops to the bottom, and the fish swims off of that when the clamp releases. We want to know, will this work for Goliath grouper? Will weighted descent, is it viable? Is it realistic? Will people do it? If it works, for recreational barotrauma mitigation of Goliath grouper. The same way it works for a red snapper, but again, we have this massive fish to work with now. So we have this new joint project to develop the best handling practice for Goliath grouper. This is with Florida Sea Grant and our team at Florida Atlantic University's Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute, where we're developing optimal release strategies for the protected Goliath grouper relevant to recreational fisheries in Florida. And again, this species, although the juveniles are available for harvest now, it's still a protected species. So we still need to make sure we're following the best sciences and the best handling practices when interacting with this animal. So the objectives here of this project are to assess the post-release behavior of vented fish versus descended fish. Remember, these are those two different methods for handling them and mitigating that barotrauma. And then we want to partner with recreational fisheries to test these methods, to develop the best practices, because we want to know what people are doing on the water, because those are our stakeholders that we're trying to make effective policies for with the science and research we're doing, and then disseminate these best practices to the relevant stakeholders, such as yourselves. So thank you for being here today, and pay attention to the information that Captain Sam and Soul Margin released, because they're going to be continuing the education as we make more conclusions from our research. But overall, check this out. This is me handling a large Goliath grouper, getting to try to release it with weighted descent, okay? You can see the clip in the fish's lip. We see some down weights, and I'm gonna take you underwater with the Goliath grouper after I show you where we're doing this work. So here's a map of the Treasure Coast of Florida. Down here in this inset, we're in this, where the black arrow is, again in St. Lucie and Martin counties. Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute is this purple schoolhouse emblem. And all of these structures, these symbols offshore, represent different artificial reefs. The gray are concrete structures, the purple are vessels, and then the red circles are a regional infrastructure for acoustic telemetry. So these are fish listening stations for tagged fish. And what we did is we used our Remus drone right here, this unmanned underwater vehicle, to produce side scan sonar plots of shipwrecks for us. 3 shipwrecks. This one's called the Voici Bernadette. This is in over 100 feet of water. This is a deep site. Then I have a shallow site called the Pipe Barge. This is in about 60 feet of water, 20 meters of water. And then a 2-ship complex called David T. Mercedes 2, and this is in about 80 feet of water. So we have 60, 80, and 100 feet of water to test barotrauma mitigation of Goliath grouper here on the Treasure Coast. So we call this project Get Down Goliath, because we are instead of the pressurized clamp is in the lip. It pops when it gets to the program depth. The fish swims away happily. And because it's a social species, one of its friends comes to say hello. So that's a perfect example of weighted descent for Goliath grouper. What does that look like from a data point of view? So glad you asked. It looks very interesting. So here is the depth chart. I'm going to orient you to this graph before I explain it. We're looking at time on the x-axis. So 0 is the beginning of time when this fish was released. And this is in hours up to about 7 days, a week's worth of time right here. And then we have a depth on the y-axis where 0, it's inverted, so 0 is the ocean surface, 1.0 is the bottom of the ocean, the sea floor. And so basically it's proportionalized, standardized the depth of over 20 fish here. And what we see when we vent the Goliath grouper is that the fish lays on the bottom for about 2 days, then it highly variable oscillations in the water column and irregular depth use, and then it finally evens out by about day 6 or 7. So again, 2 days laying on the bottom, 2 days of highly variable, and then it's normal by a week. Compare that to one that was released with weighted descent, this new experimental design, and we see normal depth use almost immediately. We see consistent depth use over time. There's not this variability that we see compared to venting. So descended fish show more depth use consistently with less recovery time. What's important to note here, though, is that both of these promote survival. Okay, the Goliath grouper will, if done right, can survive these. However, what's really interesting, though, is that I mentioned that when you vent the fish, you pierce the swim bladder. That's the balloon that they're using to regulate the buoyancy. That swim bladder is also used to make the sound that we saw earlier, that we listened to earlier. So the swim bladder is huge for sound production, which is huge for communication, social interactions, and reproduction for courtship and spawning, okay? So venting does not promote sound production. We're also looking at surface releases when the fish just swims down from the surface as another way to release them. I'm not going to include that data here, but I want to get you familiar, again, get used to seeing we're on the back of the fish again, okay? We're going to go back into some CAT scan footage again, because how you treat the fish with either venting it or weighted descent matters for the data you get back and the observations of the behavior that you get back. So massive Goliath grouper, CAT cam looking down and forward. Here's a fish's eyeball. There's one on the other side, obviously. And what you can see is when you release the fish without venting it on a descending, they're able to communicate. Okay, you can't hear it, but you can see it here. This fish is booming. The camera's shaking. What is it booming at? Well, let's start that over. Here we go. Again, so this fish was weighted descent, not vented. We see sound production, and what's going on is it's communicating with another Goliath grouper. Here we go. We've got a Goliath grouper coming in with a dark body and light face. This is a dominant male ready to spawn. We have just observed this interaction of a descended fish communicating for courtship. Basically, hey, what are you doing? Pretty interesting. It led us on to an incredible discovery where once we saw that, we tracked some fish that we had originally tagged at the pipe barge, the shallow site, and they moved to our middle depth site, the David T. Mercedes 2. This is 2 shipwrecks here again, about 10 miles offshore of Stuart, Florida. And these movements, we tracked these fish in 2022, were correlated to the new moon. The new moon phases are when these animals in the fall are getting together to spawn. That's because the ocean is at its darkest, as I mentioned, to deter the egg predators from eating up their new larvae. And so we went back to this shipwreck. We learned that these animals were using this David T. Mercedes 2 site during the new moons. We learned that in 2022. So we went back in 2023 to study them and see what was going on there. We also put in a hydrophone that listens to just the ambient noise on the shipwreck of boat traffic, of Goliath grouper, of other animals making noise underwater. So we've beefed up our remote sensing technologies there. And we went back again. Okay, so now this is before the new moon, 4 hours before sunset on the back of a Goliath grouper. And now we're swimming with a Goliath grouper in a school of Goliath grouper, right? So we can see the eyeballs moving on this animal. One large light individual to the right, one down in front, one to the left, and one above. There's at least 5 Goliath grouper in this school right now. This is at 4 p.m. before the sunset, the night before the new moon. If we get a little bit closer to sunset, here's our shipwreck speed dating. This is Goliath groupers 15 minutes before sunset interacting with other Goliath grouper. You cannot hear it, but you can see these animals making noises sound at each other. Watch the belly here. It's shaking, it's bellowing, boom, 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 boom. And now this male Goliath grouper is getting up underneath a female Goliath grouper. The female's still booming at it. They've just vent nuzzled and kind of a little bit of speed dating now, where they're going away to get to know each other a little bit better in a more private area, again, before the sun sets. Okay, this footage has never been captured before. This instance, we believe we've recorded things that only this camera can see, that a scuba diver would invade on their privacy here. It's also getting so dark, it's really getting dangerous for scuba diving. So our remote technology here has just shown us that these animals are indeed using the David T. Mercedes 2 area as a important area for spawning. We don't know if they're spawning directly on this shipwreck or if they're doing it nearby in, off the site where it's a little bit deeper, but we know that whatever happens here during the daytime and evening matters for what happens under the dark moonlight. So we're on the right track, and we're going to go back in a couple months with some new technologies. Why does this matter? Again, this spawning aggregation is literally right here on this boundary of the open harvest zone for juveniles and the closed harvest zone for juveniles, because of this recruitment of the individuals back into the Indian River Lagoon for the next generation, but also the recruitment of those juveniles to the spawning aggregations for ecotourism. So what we've shown here has been a spawning aggregation that has not been described before. It's important to be able to describe them so that we can monitor them moving forward as we're trying to study and study the population abundance through time as these regulations change. And again, this always comes back to this triangle. We've learned something new about the biology here of where these animals may be reproducing. It matters for the socioeconomics of the fishery and the dive industry, and again, the population control, more so to speak, and how is that going to influence the policy? At one time, FWC was thinking about protecting spawning aggregations in state waters. They've moved away from that, but there's definitely a clear need to understand the density and distribution of adults moving forward. Spawning aggregations is the best time to be able to get a snapshot of where these animals can be when they're gathered up together. So let's have a look at some of these other interactions that we've got from these CATS cams. Again, being underwater with a Goliath grouper, anything can happen. So here's a fish just hanging out on a reef, and a loggerhead turtle comes over to say hello. Tries to eat the camera from it and then brushes him off. I think that's because the camera was bright pink and it looked like a sponge the loggerhead wanted to eat potentially. But incredible to see these animals interacting underwater. I think these are dinosaurs together, basically. This is an interesting one when we talk about, Goliath grouper are ruining all the other fish species on the reef that humans want to eat to go home with. Well, here's a school of an incredible mutton snapper that anybody would be happy to put in the cooler, and the Goliath grouper doesn't really seem to care about them. The mutton are paying attention to it, but the Goliath's just going along on its way. To me, this shows a very natural interaction on an artificial reef of how these species coexist and cohabitate. If that animal was hooked or speared and it was an easy meal, it would be more like the video we saw at the beginning of the presentation. But again, here we have very natural interactions that can only be achieved through incredible technologies. Oops, that was the wrong. Let's see here, excuse me. Let me get me back to where the next video loads. All right. Go too far. Sorry about that. All right. When you put these cameras on the Goliath grouper, you'll often see a lot of nothing as well. They just sit, play hide and seek for a little bit, just kind of hanging out, again, being energy efficient. And then, okay, now we'll go see what's going on out there. So few hours of it not doing much at all is a fair trade-off for a few hours of doing things that are absolutely incredible that we've never seen before. These are spade fish swimming in front of the Goliath grouper here. You can imagine the Goliath grouper also kind of telling us what other fish species are around on these artificial reefs. So they may have an ecological role for these tools for beyond the Goliath grouper for other fish species. And then here's an example of how hard it is to get this data back. Here, the tag is not sitting centered on the Goliath grouper. It's little cattywampus. That's because it's about to fall off. It's supposed to float up once that piece of metal deteriorates. And here you can see the Goliath grouper bang it on a piece of structure and almost go underneath that structure, but barely floats up to the surface. If that had been another inch under that ledge, I may have never seen this footage again. So it's just to show you how lucky we have to get sometimes, and waiting to get that satellite signal once the tag breaks the surface. However, I did have a time where I hadn't heard from the tag. The tag should have popped up by now. The tag should have popped up. Where could it be? Well, it could only be underwater. And so we went back to the shipwreck and searched for it, found it, the tag attached and floated up underneath the wreck. It worked, it just got stuck. So here I am, very excited to find this lost piece of treasure on the coast. I'll make sure it still floats. Watch this. A little kiss for my data. It works. So that was me feeling like I stole one back from Davy Jones's locker there. And we've put a few more pieces of equipment on here to try to locate the tag so we know which shipwreck it's on if it is indeed underwater. But a learning experience to say the least. So with that, I'd like to conclude the talk by wrapping it up and say that Goliath grouper are again a conservation success story. This is a native species that's recovered in Florida to some degree, and this recovery is providing incredible research opportunities to again help guide this incredible species away from extinction. We know what can happen with this species. We know how susceptible they are. We have to avoid that happening again. So with that, the management objectives are changing, the actions are changing. We need new information. We need to know where these animals are reproducing. We need to know their behaviors when they're interacting with fishermen, and what are the best ways to provide new recommendations moving forward. And the local level really does matter. Again, I've shown you these boundaries where the transition is very close and we don't know the greater population connectivity yet. That matters a lot for the local spawning aggregations for recruitment to the Indian River Lagoon. Again, where I'm working, one of the most important estuaries on the east coast of Florida and in the country. And our remote technologies are really unlocking their mysterious behaviors. And as often with science, we go out to answer one question and we get some information that makes us ask 10 more new questions from it. And it's constantly evolving. So with that, I'd like to thank all of the iterations of interdisciplinary teams it's taken to achieve this work. My lab at FAU Harbor Branch, particularly Florida Sea Grant, the Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute Foundation Specialty License Plate Fund. If you see any of these shark license plates driving around the state of Florida, give them a honk for me. That's helping us facilitate some of this research right now. My contact information's here, and we can get in touch through the Soul Margin as well. I'd also like to give a plug for Harbor Branch's awesome campus. There's a lot of public outreach offerings going on there. Captain Sam has visited me there before. It's an incredible more museum, aquarium. It's a great field trip. There's boat trips into the lagoon. So plenty of information on that as well I can connect you with if anyone's ever in town or cruising down the coast. And with that, I'd like to end my presentation and open it back up for discussion with Captain Sam. Thank you all.
Part.
There you go.
Brother, I don't think they understand what they just saw, man. Like you said, there's things that you've shown that no one has never recorded, never seen. Like, I'm going crazy here, and I know they have to feel your energy when you're screaming on the water because of excitement. That's why I said this guy's legendary, man. Like, when we're around, I have energy, he has energy, and we're just vibing, man. We're just vibing. So look, let's get into the question, because I have some notes, but I don't want to take that away from other people, right? So one question we have is, what environmental or other factors determines whether they switch to male or female?
That's great. That's a great question. What we think matters on that is the sex ratio of males and females at those spawning grounds. Or another way to say that is the social dynamics of the spawning aggregations. So you could think of it often it's a male dominated. The male is often the largest one. It's an evolutionary adaptation for these fish, but you can kind of imagine it as something like ladies' night at the bar, and it's a great place for single fellas to show up, or vice versa. And so it's basically what social cues they're getting from their counterparts when they arrive to these spawning aggregations. And it's important to note that they often migrate very far. For example, from the first coast where you are, Captain Sam, St. Augustine, Jacksonville, they've been tracked coming down to Jupiter, moving over 300 kilometers. And so you can imagine when you leave for that trip, you're not sure what you're going to get when you get down here. And so we're trying to understand that more. It's a great question. And it's, again, it's one of the mysteries of this species, and where it complicates their management because of knowing how many. Well, you want 1-to-1, basically. You want a male for every female is ideal in the animal world, and that doesn't always exist. So it's a great question.
Definitely, yeah. I thought that was a great question too, and you brought up a good subject. And of course, this is going to be video on demand, right? People can watch it on time. But what I want to let the anglers know is, sometimes they're like, "Why is it so important that we up here in Northeast Florida?" Right? We'll give it to example. We're in Jacksonville area, St. Augustine. Why do I care about saving a Goliath grouper, right? Why do I care about if the state saves them, right? You literally just said that why they migrate and they go spawn in that video that you just shown, right? Very important, man. That's why, researchers like yourself work with Florida Sea Grant and work with FWC to collaborate to make these laws to protect, to keep these Goliath groupers and other animals around for a long time, right? So that's awesome. A great question. So we have another question too as well. How often do you lose the data collected by devices?
Great question as well. About 15%, 10% of the time. Oh
my God.
So if I'm shooting free throws, I'm in the Hall of Fame. I'll take it.
Yeah, bro. All day.
Yeah. 90%, we'll take it. I will say that, think about it this way though. The footage I showed you of the Goliath grouper swimming in the school, and then the one where it was speed dating, that was the same animal. I got very lucky that I put the tag on the right fish, on the right shipwreck, at the right time, and the camera came on at the right time. The animal was interacting with the other animals at the right time. So many things have to go right for it to be a success. So when I saw that first 30 seconds of the animal swimming in the water column, I said, anything else is extra. This went well enough. Yeah. Because, and even with good, a good percentage of success, what we found was so far fetched that we knew that it was incredibly rare to capture that.
Exactly. And you saw my face when I was down there and you showed me your office. I was like, what did we just see?
Yep.
And then, like you said, speed dating, like, never thought about it, but animals do the same thing, man.
Exactly. Some of us, we're kind of all wired the same way when you think about it. It's the instinct to reproduce. And the other thing I'll mention about the tags, a part of the success in getting them back is being conservative and when I'm putting them out and making sure that the weather is good on the day that we go out. That's good for fishing, but also that it's going to be good in 3 or 4 days when the tag is supposed to pop up so that we can get back out and get it again. So that's the other kind of, needle in a haystack, everything lining up to work out that we have to take into account.
That's awesome. I know I'm excited. I'm coming down with you. I know we just talked. It was supposed to be this month. Weather was different, but I'm going to be down there with Clark too as well. I'm going to experience this in person and hopefully get some film and stuff like that to share with you guys from on the boat, looking down at what Clark's doing with his research, right? So I have some quick things I want to go over, some quick notes, and we're going to get out of here, right? Number one is we talked about speed dating and spawning, and that was incredible and that was important, right? The other thing was about showing how a Goliath grouper doesn't care about a snapper or other fish like that. And that's one of the biggest things, like, here in St. Augustine, we have Goliath groupers around the main bridges downtown, right? And a lot of people don't think we do, but we do. But I've never had an issue with them, right? So I'm down for protecting them, especially even more after seeing that. Didn't know mercury was kind of an issue, right? I didn't know that, but it makes sense, right? In a bigger size fish like that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to note that mercury can, just like why we don't want to eat it as humans, we don't want to eat it because it makes us sick, right? So the mercury levels in these fish can be negatively impacting their health. So it's not just, don't eat it because you're a human. It's like, well, no, mercury in the body is not good for anybody. And so that's an issue for them and their reproduction and their overall, the big picture of it. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Sweetness. Yeah, and like even the boom like a subwoofer, I didn't know the frequencies that low, man. That's like a subwoofer in a car, but way lower, man. I can imagine how that feels in the water.
Yeah, exactly. You can feel it.
Go ahead.
You can feel it underwater, though. That's exactly right. It's more than just like you can feel it in the car,
Yeah. That'd be crazy, man. I'll probably run it on top of water if I felt that. I love how you broke it down about the CAT cam, how you related to it as like a Fitbit with a GoPro mixed with what was the EPIRB. EPIRB is relatable to everybody, right? EPIRB is important to us. I cannot the release system. Yes, I have one of those. They're amazing. You can learn more about it. I think we'll have information that show people how they can take a course to learn a bit more about how to get those release systems as well.
Right.
I love and I'm excited about the Florida Sea Grant education and the course that you have coming up. I know you are doing it with one of our speakers from last year, and I'm not going to say his name. I want to let you guys, introduce that when you're ready. But I'm super excited about that, and he's going to be on again this year. The other thing is citizen science is very important. That helps you guys out. There's some things that researchers can do, and there's other things that they can't do, right? So having an angler who's into this, having a diver into this, like you were saying, helping out FWC or helping out your university to go down and do a Goliath grouper account is very important. So if you're interested in that, make sure you reach out to Clark to see when that is going to happen and go ahead and get signed up, right? The other thing is about just reach out to FWC to show them the importance from what you learned today. Advocate for the Goliath grouper, advocate for research and funding to go to researchers like Clark and other universities that's doing this amazing research. So that is all I have on my mind. I have more to talk about, but we started a little bit late because of the IT gremlins. But dude, what amazing to kick off! What a amazing way to kick off the webinar series for Soul Margin Fishing and Conservation Foundation with legendary Clark Morgan. So, brother, thank you again. You know we're going to be talking soon after this. We're going to get talking, but we want to say thank you to all the viewers. Thank you for your patience. If you have not, please go like us on Instagram and Facebook. It helps us so much. It helps us reach more people. Like with this, we're going to take this and push this out where people can get educated. So it helps us to be able to help Clark, and help the animals and the research and conservation, and we're all loving and helping each other. So with that, you guys have a great night, and we'll see you next time.